I'm going to introduce the rest of the panel in no particular order. May I first ask Madeline Muga, Strategy and Impact Director at Fairtrade Africa, to come on up here. I'm lonely. And then Escipion Oliveira Gomez, Director of the Division of Enterprise Competitiveness and Institutions at the International Trade Center. And last but not least, Matt Kovac, Chief Executive Officer at Food Industry Asia. Yes, we'll go boy, girl, boy, girl. So good afternoon and welcome. I'm really sorry that we're standing in the way of your coffee break, but at least it's not the wine reception. I think there's always a positive side. I have to say that this panel is near and dear to my heart, having been IFC's Global Director for ESG for 5 years before I arrived on the continent. And while I do consider myself a strong sustainability champion, I am also super familiar with companies struggling to meet environment and social standards in our projects. The impact of new regulatory measures promoting ENS standards in food systems is a timely and critical topic, but it's also a complex one. There's a lot to recommend sustainability-driven regulations. They're designed to protect our environment and advance social equity by reducing deforestation, promoting fair labor practices, and enabling the long-term viability of our food systems. These regulations also foster greater transparency in supply chains, ensuring that our food systems are both fair and sustainable. However, we also need to acknowledge the challenges that come with these measures, particularly for smallholder farmers and small businesses in developing countries. For example, the increased costs of compliance can be prohibitive for the smaller actors involved in the food supply chain. To address challenges is going to take a village. We need a collective effort from consumers, from companies, governments, and international organizations. Today's panel is going to unpack the challenges and also offer some potential solutions to address them. I've already introduced my three distinguished guests. So to set the stage for us, I'm going to hand the floor to you, Matt, to provide a brief overview of sustainability-driven regulations in agri-food supply chains before I move into the discussion. Go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Originally, I was supposed to make the short intervention, but we had someone drop out from the panel, so I've joined the panel as well. So thank you very much for giving me double airtime. I'll read out my speech to make sure I stick to the 5 minutes. So Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's an honor and a pleasure for me to attend this conference here in Addis Ababa. I actually am based in Asia. I'm based in Kuala Lumpur and in Singapore, between the two. And I primarily look after developing markets on behalf of SMEs and some multinational food companies in that part of the world. But there are some significant similarities to parts of Africa. Now, governments across the globe are increasingly recognizing the implications of supply chain interconnectedness and the dependence on global value chains for achieving economic as well as sustainable development objectives. Simultaneously, consumers are increasingly becoming aware of businesses' social and environmental performance, and of course we see cases of calling them out for underperformance, particularly in the global north. This has resulted in the private sector actors experience increased pressure to adhere to high standards of accountability and transparency regarding the impact of their business practices on communities, the nature, and of course the environment. These sustainability-related regulations are intended to encourage businesses to perform better. For instance, by identifying risks, mitigating and responding to them, and holding the private sector accountable. Now, over the last 2 decades, a plethora of sustainability-related regulations have taken center stage, with several regulations being adopted by governments, primarily in the global north, that promote responsible business conduct, transparency in supply chains, respect for human rights, and environmental standards. Examples of those would be the UK's Modern Slavery Act, Switzerland's non-financial due diligence reporting, and the recently delayed implementation of the EU Deforestation-Free Regulation, EUDR. Now, however, many of these regulations have been developed unilaterally without as much collaboration between the private sector and companies, particularly SMEs, and governments of potentially affected countries or other value chain actors. Now, vulnerable actors, and in particularly my region, micro and small and medium-sized enterprises, can find it increasingly challenging to comply due to the lack of understanding of the requirements and the measures they could adopt to comply with each of them. Now, this is of particular relevance related to environmentally driven regulations and policies that impact food supply chains from farmers all the way through to small business operators. Many parts of Asia are particularly susceptible to climate change and that impact, given their dense coastal populations, and of course some weaker infrastructure, and that really does impact livelihoods, food security, and the millions of people's health, particularly women. So some new research that my organisation and another organisation, AFBA, commissioned with Oxford Economics actually shows that for every 1% increase in average temperature, it raises food producer prices by between 1% to 2% across some key markets like Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. This analysis also shows that food production costs would rise by anywhere between 30 to 60% in a scenario in which the world achieves net zero emissions by 2050 compared to the current baseline. Now, and that's credible regulations, not crazy policies, that's credible regulations. So if you look at that, that's a double-edged sword. We do need to move towards net zero, but simultaneously by doing so and not having support for SMEs in the agricultural sector, this could be dangerous. The price of inaction, though, would have just as much, or if not greater, regressive consequences. Natural resource-based sectors such as agriculture and fisheries in my part of the world, they are directly conditioned by and impacted by climate. And they account for around a third of total employment, which threatens the livelihoods of much of Asia's poor. Climate change will increase the spread of vector-borne, waterborne diseases and deaths due to cardiovascular stress, and under very high emission scenarios could impose GDP losses of 30% in Southeast Asia, and that's according to the Asian Development Bank, and that's by the year 2100. So the regional food security risk is incredibly real, but its significance stretches actually beyond Southeast Asia due to a significant portion of food imports to Africa, to South Asia, and of course the Middle East. So Southeast Asia's food production matters, not just, especially for the least developed countries, because the import share stands at 23%, which is up from around 14% 2 decades ago, and it's increasing. So ASEAN's significance in food production is rising. This positive externality makes a case for global cooperation to support producers in my part of the world to mitigate the impact of physical and transition risks related to the transition to net zero. Now, with climate change exacerbating food price volatility and the energy transition posing significant risks to food production costs, there is a critical imperative for governments to prioritize policies that attract and retain foreign direct investment in the food sector, but also building capacity for SMEs in domestic economies. Meanwhile, developing partners play a pivotal role, as we know, with UNIDO, FAO, and others, in supporting that transition to net zero emissions and future-proofing against regulations. Now, while companies are in the process of understanding and exploring common requirements across these regulations, and they look towards trying to comply, it becomes critical to identify the tools, the platforms, the services, and the standards that can be used to support compliance. Effective due diligence will require companies to systematically improve their supply chain practices, and the comment from the previous panel was that that's incredibly difficult, and why shouldn't there be standards for Africa, and why not? Still, the global dialogue is needed to support all food producers, particularly in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and of course in Africa, in meeting these compliance costs. And remember, the speed of these new regulations and standards must be at the pace that gives all producers in the food supply chain time to adapt to reduce the risk of excessive strain in the short term, while protecting those who are most vulnerable to food prices increases, and that is our consumers. So thank you, Mary.
Thanks very much, Matt. You've anticipated some of my questions, but I'm still going to ask them. So just to give you all a quick sense of the format, we're going to try to cycle through 3 rounds of questions and then open it up to you all. Emphasis on the word try. I have a lot of questions, and selfishly, I'd like to hear from all the panelists on all the questions, if possible, only because I know you represent very diverse vantage points. So please do jump in. I'll try to make that space for you, even if the question isn't directed at you. So for round 1, we're going to explore what these regulatory measures mean for agribusinesses and smallholder farmers. So I'll start with Madeline and Escipion. What do you see as the main challenges and opportunities for smallholder farmers and SMEs in implementing more sustainable production practices in the agri-food supply chain? And Madeline, let's just go ahead and start with you when it comes to the smallholder producers.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for staying around. My name is Madeline Muga, and I'm going to stand on where everybody has been standing today on the existing protocol. I work for Fairtrade Africa. Fairtrade Africa is part of a larger system of Fairtrade organizations with a particular role. My role as Fairtrade Africa is to support Fairtrade certified producers to remain certified, to follow the standards, and to be able to sell on Fairtrade terms. On Fairtrade terms, it means they have a minimum price and they have a premium for producing on Fairtrade terms. Now, we support about 1.4 million farmers and workers in Africa. So when we talk about the threat for hunger, we have 1.4 million members in about 670 producer organizations that would be threatened if their livelihoods are also threatened. And we are talking about the voluntary sustainability regulations that are coming our way. For us as Fairtrade Africa, we are looking at how we shift the focus first. First, we do agree on the principles and the vision of the regulations that are coming our way, the sustainability-driven regulations that are coming our way. This vision, we buy it, we believe in it. The principles behind it, we want to implement these regulations. But the focus is on the potential value when we have not even implemented or complied with these regulations. For you to run, for you to walk, you need to crawl. So we are running and walking before we really even crawl. So if we shift and look at the challenges that we are facing as smallholder farmers, then if the envisaged impact can only remain a dream if we do not address the challenges that farmers face. For us, we recognize the opportunities, but we have been overwhelmed by the compliance measures that are coming our way. And remember, these are new measures. They are sitting on already existing issues that we have to deal on, heavily sitting on farmers who are not getting a good price for their crop, who are struggling with climate, are hit hard on climate, low productivity, low price, all these things, inflation, put all those things and put the new regulations. We have to comply with them. Where do we find the money? EUDR found us really having put down everything to comply by January. And you can imagine for producers, if we don't comply, what do we lose? Ladies and gentlemen, we lose access to markets. We are talking about hunger. Majority of the producers that Fairtrade works with are for your traditional export products. The coffee, the cocoa, the tea, and we only consume a very small percentage of what we produce. Majority is for export. So if we cannot access our traditional markets, then we cannot even be able to feed ourselves. Somebody here earlier talked about we need to find trillions. We only have hundreds to be able to comply. Financial support, technical support, capacity building is one of the things that we are doing, supporting farmers to be able to comply. So it's not that we do not want to comply, but we do not have the capacity to comply. Thank you.
Thank you, Madeline. So maybe same question about challenges and opportunities, Escipion, from an SME perspective.
Hello. Thanks for the invitation. First, I really wanted to thank UNIDO for the opportunity to speak here. ITC, for those that do not know, we are the son or the daughter of the WTO and the United Nations working together to help SMEs succeed in the world in international trade. And we try to place ourselves as an honest broker between the donors, the regulations, and the SMEs. Before we were here, they were talking about hunger. I have never in my life experienced hunger, but I have seen many people experience hunger, and it's heartbreaking. And sometimes when you are sitting in your comfortable desk and doing regulations, it's difficult to see how the SMEs in the field react, and I feel very much of what you say. We must say that in the last 5 years, there have been rules about organic production, carbon border and adjustment mechanism, corporate responsibility due diligence, forced labor, deforestation, tobacco parts in food and seeds. So you must understand that this is like a foreign language to us agriculture. So maybe the first thing that we try to do is to translate all these complex languages into people that in the field can understand, and it's very, very difficult. And I like proverbs, and I like songs. There's a famous song from a Mexican group called Maná, which is, where will my children play? So I want to reassure everybody that people in developing countries, we do love our children, and we want them to swim in clean rivers and swim in clean beaches. But the present day is important. I worked a lot in Haiti. If a Haitian has to cut a tree to cook that night, are you going to tell him, don't eat, don't worry, in 10 years, we will bring to you charcoal. In 10 years, you're dead. So I am also an economist, and I like Keynes. Keynes used to say, in the long term, we will all be dead. So we have to put ourselves in that time. What are we trying to do? We have really to train people, translate these regulations into something they can assume. But to do that, you have to work closely with the SMEs. Also with the BSOs, it's impossible for us to come and trade each BSO, each company can try to work through fair trade. We had the privilege of working here with a big congregation of farmers, Orami. And for example, one of the things of compliance is that you need to geolocalize, because at the end of the day, everything is on traceability. For all these regulations, you have to ensure where the product comes from. So for example, we have around this union of cooperatives in Ethiopia has 500,000 farmers. We worked for several years, and we have been able to geolocalize 42,000. But we're still only 8% after many work. So to be the truth, we need time, we need money. We also need to we were talking about, already have a red card. Just to say, we need also to put the appropriate infrastructure. For example, in Pakistan, we are building cold storage in the field for bananas with solar energy. We have accredited through our work 3 labs in Burundi to allow people to have the correct certificates to export. Our global public goods are very well known, so also people need to know information about what are the trends, how can we better capacitate. But at the end of the day, I think is to translate and also understand. If you look at the deforestation regulation, if a country like Gabon that has 86% forest coverage today, you tell them you cannot cut down a tree to do anything, you're telling them you cannot develop. And so you're being penalized for keeping your forest. And then you have other countries, I would say Vanuatu and Togo, which are smaller. Can they go into put the infrastructure for all the traceability? It will be difficult for them just because of volumes. So we need to save the earth, but the present is very important. You cannot tell somebody, don't worry, you'll eat in 10 years.
Thanks for that. You mentioned Haiti and charcoal, and 30 years ago, or a few years ago when I began my career, I began it in Haiti. And I remember being struck by flying over Hispaniola and seeing the demarcation between Haiti and the Dominican Republic because the trees had been cut down, which is a perfect segue to you, Matt, because you get the $64,000 question. How can we balance the need for sustainability with maintaining food security, especially in agriculture-dependent regions?
Yeah, that's a delicate balancing act. I think how we look at that, certainly in Southeast Asia, is as I said, there's a big impact from climate change already now, and that will grow and only get worse. But in that transition to net zero, the impact on food production and prices will be quite high as well. So it comes from, in that transition, you'll have increase in labor costs, and energy as well, because many of those economies in Southeast Asia are actually reliant on fossil fuels. Indonesia is reliant on 60 to 70% of its economy is reliant on fossil fuels. So that shorter term transition will have a big impact. That's probably not discussed as much as it should be. In fact, even the Asian Development Bank said across the whole of Asia, not just Southeast Asia, that there will be an increase of around 35% in food prices if there aren't mitigation strategies to offset the impact of transitioning to net zero. So this is a really big deal which isn't discussed as much as it should be. And of course, those most vulnerable in society at the bottom of the pyramid and those consumers will be the ones that actually go hungry. And already what we've seen, of course, is rising rates of inflation and slower economic growth, the impact of COVID on debt. So there may not be the financial assistance from governments to help with this transition as well, as much as there was before. So this is incredibly delicate. I think bigger companies, multinationals, play an important role in terms of foreign direct investment, and for economies to loosen perhaps or look at the ability to allow for that, not just that foreign direct investment, but retaining that foreign direct investment through various measures, yeah, in particular in terms of ownership, and allowing those linkages between those big companies to then support those SMEs as well in terms of hands-on experience of how you can improve as well to help you mitigate against the transition to the transition to net zero. Those are going to be fundamentally important in Southeast Asia and Asia and probably in parts of Africa. But I do know as well that there is competitive advantage to certain multinationals adhering to some of these regulations. I'm honest about that. I work with both multinationals and SMEs, and I see that tension. So, for example, one would be the recent delay on the EU deforestation-free regulations, where actually some of the big companies like Nestle and Mondelez and Mars have actually said, no, they want to continue with the regulation immediately because they've already made the investments. Whereas for others in that supply chain, it's a lot more difficult and they need more time. So there's going to be some real tensions in mitigating those increases in food prices.
Thanks. And I wanted to move us to round two, but I can see Madeline wants to jump in, and that's the whole point of this. So go ahead, Madeline.
Thank you. Allow me to jump in. Yeah. About the structure and what you've mentioned, Matt, about the structure of enforcement. We have the big players, we have the small players, we have middle players, but they are all being painted with one brush. How do we ensure that the burden of compliance is distributed evenly? The big players are able to comply very quickly with the regulations. We want to, but we don't have the resources. Producers are committing time, resources, everything that they have to ensure they comply so that they don't lose markets. On the other hand, for producers, you begin to see how the challenge that lies with the different levels of accountability. For some, it's mandatory. For some, you hear the language such as required to pay attention. So the language seems to get softer and softer as you go up the value chain and as you meet the big boys. But for us, at the start of the value chain, it's mandatory. How do we even out the burden and ensure that everybody across the value chain is held by the same standards, but that we support each other?
Just to add that, in fact, I agree with everything you said. And I think ITC, under the direction of our director, Pamela Cook Hamilton, we want to transform trade and change lives. But these regulations have been seen by the Global South as an imposition. because they were not developed together. And I think that if you really want to make it successful, sit down with people and do it together. So we say, please incorporate the farmers as well. And that's where fair trade comes in. The cooperatives, involve local governments, involve the business support organization, the chambers, the cooperatives, because everybody, we want a better future. And the next, and that where it hits is time and resources to do so. Because you're trying to invest in geolocalization where you don't have electricity in your own home. How many farmers in Ethiopia have electricity in their home? And you want them to geolocalize. We want to talk to a company, a coffee company here. Their main issue is trying to buy a transformer to have electricity in the factory. So you're talking about two different realities. And that type of realities have to be discussed. So we do agree and we strongly support protecting the environment, but please help developing countries to help themselves.
Good point. Second round is about exploring the costs and solutions. I think all three of you touched quite a bit on costs, but maybe you might want to add on unintended effects on smallholder farmers and SMEs, but I really don't want us to leave this segment without also talking about solutions, because Madeline, you mentioned a bit when it comes to things that are needed, access to markets, and the fact that the small guys are overwhelmed by compliance measures. I can tell you from an IFC point, we see regional and global players overwhelmed by the measures, so it's very understandable that the smaller players would be as well. But maybe going in reverse order and just kicking it back to you, Matt, on any of those themes, unintended consequences, costs we haven't touched on or gone deep enough, or solutions. And we can't leave without solutions again because of the opening plenary.
Yeah, so some of those solutions, I think, so in my part of the world, particularly around addressing the full gambit of sustainability, but perhaps more on environment, is some of the programs around capacity building. So there's something very interesting it's based in Thailand called the Sustainable Rice Platform, SRP. It gets funding from the Global Energy Fund. And that's looking at raising the quality and standards of rice growing and mitigating the impacts of methane and methane emissions within rice growing. So there's some real important capacity building programs that are happening to try to get industries, smallholder farmers prepared for some of these quite onerous sustainability-driven regulations, and particularly for ASEAN, where it's exporting something around 38-40% of world's rice, right? It's a major exporter, and they want to increase those exports to Europe. So I think that there are some of those capacity building programs, but of course financing and scaling them is still an issue. And we talk about that a lot, and I still don't have a solution around that except for more funds, more ability to do some of that training and capacity building. I would add one more point though, is just to say that when it comes to multinationals having to adhere to some of the sustainability-driven regulations, it's not always that easy. And certainly from an audit basis, and in my part of the world, that audit and complying with some of those audits is incredibly challenging indeed, yeah, and incredibly costly. And I think a colleague actually mentioned and said to me, there was an example in Switzerland actually about the cost of those audits. And if you think about the number of audits that big, small, medium-sized companies have to make, the savings that you could make from that could actually be translated into putting it towards capacity building programs to help those micro or SMEs be prepared for some of these sustainability-driven regulations.
Yes, thank you very much. I think that the solutions are similar. First, capacity building. ITC is helping a lot in that capacity building, bringing the voice of the farmers to Europe. I had the opportunity to be in discussions with the European Parliament. When you have the discussions and you can tell legislators what implication they have, because I think we're all in the same boat. We're working with the European Union, what we call accompanying measures, basically going to them to the field to explain and have that discussion and bringing with us companies. For example, Lavazza Coffee from Italy is accompanying us, and they are also facing challenges because it's also helping the international companies to be able to succeed. Because at the end of the day, they do want that the farmer to have a decent living. And I think one of the main things is having things like this, talking to people, have a one United Nations approach. I'm very happy that we're working this with UNIDO. We are working also a business-friendly program where the World Bank, UNIDO, and ITC are working together. And I think that if we can all concentrate together in SDG number 1, which is no poverty, a lot of the things will be solved. I think that also the exchange of best practices between Asia, Pacific, Caribbean, Africa is very important because and that is also where Fairtrade comes in because we work with Fairtrade in that sense. What innovative approach was used by a cooperative to find the solutions? And I would like to say that, I'd like to quote somebody very famous that said once, I have a dream, and my dream is that tomorrow, poverty and agriculture are not synonymous in the developing world.
So Martin Luther King and Mana. These are your quotes. Okay, good. I won't forget you. Madeline.
Thank you. Without repeating what you have said, we have like 100 irons in the fire. We are doing capacity building. We have found a seat at the table to talk about the regulations and the impact it's having on us. And if we can mitigate some of the language, some of the regulations they are bringing to our way and ensure that, it carries the voice and the needs and the aspirations of farmers. So we are doing that as well, advocacy. We're looking at how we can ensure that the products are traceable. So there are many things that are going on. Value addition. Did you drink coffee today? It is produced in Ethiopia. It is packed here, roasted in Ethiopia and packed here with a label telling you that it has sustainably been produced, the farmer has a good price, the environment has been protected. The same with the flowers that you see here. So there are a lot of efforts and initiatives going on. The challenge for us is that when the regulations come and when they interpret them for us, then as Fairtrade Africa, we go to our producers and do what we can with the limited resources that we have. So the efforts are really fragmented. How do we go to scale? Why is this the burden of producers only? And my call and my challenge is to our government. Who can do geolocation better? Is it the government or is it the smallholder producer organization? I don't know why this burden ended up with us, but what is happening, one of the unintended impacts for us is that we go to the producer organizations, for example, we take their geolocation, and then the trader comes and takes their geolocation, and you come and take their geolocation, and the resources we have are really spread thin. How can we go to scale? Who will take us to scale is really the question that I have. We have put our best foot forward, but we are looking for a coordinating body, organization, government that really takes us to scale so that we can comply. For us, market access is very important. And then we want to produce for today and also for tomorrow. So we don't want to, like my mother would say, cook the food and put a hole in the pan or in the pot, and then tomorrow you cannot cook. We want to continue to produce the cocoa, the coffee, the tea, till kingdom come.
So maybe we move into round 3, unless any of you want to react to this. Round 3 is about you asking each other questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Just one point, and it's because none of us have spoken about it, but it's about women empowerment. I was reading, preparing for this, that 70% of agricultural produce in Africa are produced by women, but they can only have access to 20% of the land and only on 10% of the land. So I do believe that there has to be some kind of land reform and change customary law to allow women to have access to land, because you cannot go to a bank. And when we talk about resources, it's always the same thing. Money in developing countries is there, but it's not given to agriculture because it's in too long term, too risky. So guarantee schemes. And this is also where I think the union has to come. How can we convince bankers to look at a long-term return rather than to immediate financial return? And things that is one of the questions that we have to work together, and it was part of the discussions before, but I want to make the link between having schemes that allow farmers to get, and that the managers of funds, I used to work supervising many developing funds, and always they wanted to put the ticket always higher because they earn on that. And the middle, the missing middle is a challenge. So money, because everything we spoke recovers funds. But funds but they are not affordable nor long term. Sorry, David.
Allow me to just take that, what you've said, how do we ensure that women and young people, and on a light note, why not make a regulation about it? Because you've seen what regulations have made us do. Commit additional resources, go out and really ensure that we don't lose markets. What if we would lose markets if women, 70% of the women did not retain the value? So on a light note, can we make a regulation that women need to be involved in capturing the value and in retaining some of the value of where their sweat goes to? But that is just on a light note. I think we don't need more regulations. We need to really comply with what we already have to be able to, and to really to be able to scale and to ensure that we produce sustainably.
So help to deliver on the existing regulations and change laws, and not just in the agriculture sector, by the way. Unfortunately, women are disadvantaged across the board, but that's something that our World Bank brother and sister works a lot through women business and the law, including in the ag sector. So something to watch. So as I started to say, you all come from different organizations, working on different parts of the world with different players in this food system. Is there anything you want to ask each other?
Yes, I wanted to ask Matt, because how can you spark more collaboration between Asia, Africa, and the Americas? Because we most of the time we always look north, but I am very much into South-South collaboration. And also, how can we have developing countries fund other developing countries?
Yeah, I was going to ask you that, so you've asked, because that's a difficult question to answer. I would agree with you, yes, in terms of South-South learning, that's the whole reason why I've attended this conference, right, my first time to Addis Ababa, to explore how some of the programs, how some of the policies, some of the thinking for parts of South Asia and Southeast Asia could be translated and learned from in Africa, and likewise from some of the previous panels earlier, what Southeast Asia and other parts of Asia can learn from Africa. I don't know about Latin America and Caribbean as well. There has to be some sort of mechanism, and I would probably look to someone like UNIDO to try to facilitate some sort of South-South learning specifically related to agriculture and food business operators, and a conference where we only have that global South in the room to talk about what's good for them and not necessarily what's being dictated to from the global North. And we would start off with that, and I think that opportunity for me of that learning and how you can create those linkages there would be incredibly important, and particularly looking at those private sector companies that are operating more within that sort of global South as well. So one company that springs to mind, which is actually listed in Singapore, is Olam. Olam is an agricultural commodity player, and Sonny Verghese is a great guy who runs that company, and they've also created and started and spun off an ingredients company. And so I think that type of company, and having them in the room and others like them to talk with the development partners as well to learn would be a great start. So I'm effectively saying, let's get UNIDO to set up another conference and look at where we would do that and try to facilitate that conversation, because that doesn't happen enough.
A question for you about data. Producers are sharing a lot of data with the markets, with governments, with different players, but they don't own the data. How do we ensure? And data has a financial value today. How do we ensure that they own some of the data that they are sharing, and that some of the agencies are also drawing a financial value to it? I know you have some initiatives around that. Maybe you could enlighten us?
Thank you very much for that question. In fact, that was a discussion yesterday with our company, for our brothers from Oromia, and I'm sorry that I said the first name of the cooperative. Yes, they're producing data, and we were having that discussion. How can that be monetized? Shared with telephone companies, shared with banks and insurance companies, but of course, with the understanding and agreement by the farmers. And how can we reshare it? because data is very important. And yes, ITC is well known a lot for data, and we're looking into how that can happen. Yeah, but yes, do I have a specific solution? No, but we're really thinking about it. How can that wealth be distributed without really, because if the data stays only at macro level, it will not benefit the farmers. And just to say that, as well, ITC is very much engaged in women empowerment through seed trades and other ones, and other systems. My boss is really into that, and as well as all of us, of course.
Matt, did you want to ask anyone?
Yes, I did. Sorry, yes. Madeline, I'd love to ask you a question. You said something that was, how would we have a regulatory system or even policies that could benefit, no, not benefit. How would it be applied to multinationals and how can that be applied to SMEs? So for example, if you take certain packaging-related regulations in Southeast Asia, there are exclusions for micro and very small businesses. But how would you do that without multinationals screaming, saying it's not a fair and level playing field? The medium-sized companies would have to do that too. How do we do that? Because we don't want to create inherent conflict, but at the same time, I do hear what you're saying.
I don't have an answer. I'm not working for a multinational, but I think for me, the question is how do we even out everything? The multinational is able to say no, but the farmer, the smallholder farmer, is not able to say no. Even if we don't have a voice, we can't afford it, we will still end up with the compliance measures that we have to comply with. I can't afford it, but when they make the rules and regulations, when the multinational says the burden is too big for me, it's too expensive, don't pin this on me, they will hear. But for smallholder farmers, we are not even at the table. I don't have an answer.
But one of the things that we really try to use is also public procurement. How can public procurement help the smaller companies? And how, for example, I come from a country that is very well known for tourism, and we have integrated industry in the tourism industry. But in other islands, that doesn't happen. If you go, for example, to some islands in the Caribbean, you might be drinking Scottish whiskey, eating American beef, eating fruits from other countries. So how do you integrate those farmers into the industry that you already have? And that linkages has to be done as well. It's not exactly what you asked.
No, it is, because there's a panel after talking about agritourism,
yes,
which may actually, from a strategic perspective, it's something that Thailand's pursued quite aggressively, although the COVID pandemic set them back. But Thailand's an exceptional example of how they're trying to leverage agritourism for their domestic industry to show what they're producing, what they're eating across the whole value chain.
That's a best practice. We went from the Caribbean to visit them because of that.
And considering that, for example, in Eastern Africa, tourism is a big sector, you can see there is no, they're not working together, there's no collaboration. And as you are saying, what can we learn from the other regions and bring it, what is working in the other regions without us having to reinvent the wheel? I think that would be really great if we can see how we bring the two sectors together, agriculture and ecotourism, to ensure that even farmers, value addition for us is really, really critical. How do we ensure that farmers have diversified sources of income? And this could be one opportunity.
And also, if we talk about coffee, which we have a lot of coffee, is how you do multi-cropping. Cocoa and coffee gold work together. Another, we're also promoting with Afreximbank that I was talking before, the production of manioc, cassava, and things like that. So yes, looking at all of those and agroforestry, and basically go back to traditions. And in fact, something that I really want to promote is how can we protect the knowledge of our ancestors? Because they lived in the land. They knew how to deal with climate change, maybe not as drastic, but we're losing all that knowledge. So value all traditions, whether intercropping and things like that. So yeah, I think that, yeah, after that goes to zero, they shoot us. So let's stop.
I have to admit, I don't remember when we started. Do we have time for Q&A with the audience? No. That's a negative. So I will wind us up super fast. and just thank the audience and thank the panel. I don't think I can do justice for a summary of this conversation because we covered a lot of ground, but what was clear for me is the importance of supporting smaller players, smallholder farmers, small businesses to meet these new and emerging sustainability requirements, the importance of collective action, the importance of learning across geographies, the importance of retaining what we learned from our ancestors. I wish we had another 1 or maybe even 3 hours. I think we could keep going. Before I sign off, I was charged with making 2 public service announcements on behalf of UNIDO. First, tomorrow, UNIDO is hosting a side event to present the UNIDO Solutions Platform, which will showcase a project example where digital tools are helping the coffee industry to benefit from sustainability-driven regulations. And second, to delve deeper into today's topic, UNIDO will be hosting an event on January 30th called Who Pays and Who Should Pay for the Cost of Compliance. And I think there are more details on LinkedIn. So, the end. Thank you all.